Welcome to this Mind Out webinar on Pride Without Prejudice, Multicultural Insights into LGBTQ plus Wellbeing and Experiences. My name's Liz Wilkinson and my pronouns are she and they, and I'm the Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Manager over at LGBTIQ plus Health Australia. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. They acknowledge their diversities, their histories, their knowledge and continuing connection to water, land and culture. I'd like to pay our collective respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I'd also particularly like to pay my respects to the elders of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is where I'm joining from, and I'd welcome all of you to share where you're joining from in the chat function. At this point, I'd also like to acknowledge people with living experience of mental health or suicidal distress, as well as their carers and families, and know the continued role that they play in the reform of the mental health system. In housekeeping, I want to just quickly note that today's webinar is being recorded, so it'll be made available via our website and YouTube channel, so you can go back and listen to it if you miss anything. For questions, we invite you to use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we'll aim to get to those questions either through the webinar or we might discuss them at the end of the session in a Q&A live session. A reminder now also that if anything in today's webinar brings up any issues for you, there is support available, such as with QLife, which provides free Australia-wide anonymous support for LGBTIQ plus community. You can call QLife on 1800 184 527, or you can use their chat function via their website. And there's also other helplines available. So I'll leave that up on screen just to be mindful of. And for today's webinar, I'm really excited to be joined by a number of guests to explore this topic. And I'd like to acknowledge, though, there is so many diverse topics and subtopics within this that are worth exploring. And I think on that basis, we're probably going to be doing a part 2 to multicultural experiences of LGBTQ plus wellbeing. And so watch this space. We will be doing more in this topic, but I'm still really excited to hear from our presenters today and listen to their insights. And finally now, I'd like to hand over to our facilitator for today, James Xiao. James is a member of Mind Out's Peer Expert Advisory Group, and amongst other things, he's passionate program manager with extensive experience in group facilitation, community development, cross-cultural leadership, positive psychology, and LGBTIQA+ advocacy. So I'll let James carry us through most of the rest of today's session. And thank you so much, James, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Liz, and a warm welcome to all our participants and audience who are actually joining us from all over the country. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm joining this event, and that will be the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to pay my respect to the elders past and present. I'm very, very delighted and feeling very honored and privileged, to be joining like a panel of magnificent speakers. As part of our preparation for today's webinar, we had like a meeting last week, and I'm so in awe of everyone's experience and the wisdom, that they bring to the meeting. And so we would be really happy to like share this with our participants today. So I would just like to introduce our speakers. We've got 3 speakers in the panel. We have got Bernard, Signa, and Jean. So I would like to give everyone just a bit of background about everyone's experience. So Bernard is an early career academic researcher and lecturer at the University of Technology, Sydney. So Bernard's main interest is in subject designer, developer, coordinator across a number of disciplines in the Bachelor of Public Health formerly known as the Health Science Program. And he teaches across topics ranging from health promotion, communication, diversity, global human rights, and health inequity. And Bernard has also been involved in a number of research publications and conference presentations, both locally and globally. The second speaker that we have is Signe, and she was born on the unceded land of the Darug people and currently resides in the Gadigal People's Country. As a senior registered psychologist with over 2 decades of clinical experience, she not only practices but also teaches at universities nationally and internationally. And lastly, we have got Jean, who is a research officer with the Australian Research Centre for Sex, Health and Society. Jean has worked with the centre since 2018 across a wide range of projects. So his debut project called Understanding LGBTIQ plus Lives in Crisis was an investigation into LGBTIQ plus people's engagement with crisis counseling services, which went on to win the University-wide Excellence in Research Impact Award in 2021. And since then, Jean has been involved in projects and publications on topics ranging from family, domestic and sexual violence, homelessness, mental health, sexual health, community connections among LGBTIQ people, suicide, self-harm, sex education, and even recently involving alcohol and other drugs as well. So as we can see, between all of us panelists here, we bring a wealth of experience and quite in-depth lived experience, research, teaching, connections, peer work, clinical work in the community. So I would just like to give a little bit of the overview of what we can expect in today's program. We would start with Bernard and Signe, who will be talking about the insights based on work, including research which is titled Arab and Gay. So that would take about half an hour. And after that, we would go for a break at 1:45 for about 5 minutes. And when we return after break, Jean will be talking about the exclusion from LGBTIQ plus community and the flow-on effects in mental health and service areas. Then I will be sharing some of my lived experience and the experience working with peers because I do facilitate support and mental health support workshops in the community. So I'll be sharing a little bit of my experience in that area. And after that, we will attend to some of the questions in the Q&A. So you will notice at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A function. We would invite you to ask any questions that you may have throughout today's session, and they will be responded to by any of the panelists here as we move along. And in the last 10 minutes of today's session, we will also tackle some of these questions that might not have been answered earlier on. And you will also see that you will have a chat function, which means that all participants will be able to chat with one another. You can also type your comments or any resources that you would like in the chat box as well. I think that's about it in terms of introduction. So without further ado, I would like to invite Bernard and Signe to launch into our first presentation and sharing. Over to you.
Thank you, James, for that warm welcome, and thank you, Liz, for this opportunity. Before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands the UTS City campus, where I am now, now stands. I'd also like to pay respect to both elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge, particularly as I come to you from a university for this land. And I'd also further like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various ancestral lands from which all of you are joining us from today, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge any Indigenous people who are joining us today. So I'll give you a little bit of a summary of what Signe and I are going to talk about. We'll start with a little bit of a sort of a story from the therapy room, actually from Google to the therapy room to the research office. And then we'll sort of weave in and out. So we'll come in and out of the presentation, the two of us, and then we'll end it with a sort of a brief overview of some of the research that I've been doing at the Kirby Institute. So I will start by sharing my screen. Just give me a second. Just make sure I'm sharing sound as well. Okay. Can you all see that? I'm going to assume you can. I can't see anything.
Yes.
Okay, good.
All's working well. Thank you,
Very
Bernard.
good. This is a 20-minute video. I'm not going to play the whole thing.
أتمنى أن لا يجب علي المبادرة. حاولت وحاولت ولكنكم لم تستمعون لي. أنا فخور بنفسي وبحياتي. فمن المحسن أن تختارون الاستسلام من توقعات المجتمع وتصبحون بالتالي بعداء عن ابنكم. صحتي العقلية والنفسية ليست جيدة. لقد حاولت أن أكون صادقا معكم ولكن لاحظنا أن ذلك يؤدي إلى مزيد من المشاكل. يجب أن أعتني بنفسي. لست سعيدا بحياتي هنا. أصعب شيئا بالنسبة لي أنني حاولت أن أعيش حياة طبيعية على الرغم من أن والدي يقولون لي أن حياتي خطر.
Okay, so I will. Okay. So I'll just give some context to people. I imagine majority of people who probably didn't understand what I was saying in that video. This was a sort of a declaration that I was encouraged to write by my psychologist at the time. And you can probably tell this video is from a while ago when I had a lot more hair on my head and I looked quite a lot younger. The declaration was an encouragement by the psychologist at the time who is joining us today, Sekna. She was my therapist during those dark times. And it was, I was encouraged to write this letter to my parents and read it to them in Arabic. Bit of context about myself. I have a history as a migrant from Lebanon to Australia. I moved here in 2001 with my parents. And I grew up in a socially conservative part of Sydney, in Western Sydney. Some of you probably know that this part of Sydney is quite multicultural, rich in its multicultural identity, which also comes with some challenges for a queer person, sort of grappling with this intersectional identity crisis of being gay and Christian and migrant and Lebanese and queer and queer gay. Yeah. So at the time of writing that letter, I remember it was quite a dark time and I didn't really have the access to much support. So this is where I met Sekna, and I mentioned earlier that I went from Google to the therapy room. And the truth is, I had sought therapy and mental health support from other avenues unsuccessfully. I think I went to a number of psychologists at the time who didn't really understand the cultural context of where I was coming from. And the advice that was given to me was, in hindsight, I can judge it as culturally unsafe and not very considerate of the cultural context. And so I did. I Googled something like Arabic psychologist, queer Arab psychologist, or gay Arab psychologist, or something, and I found Sekna's name, and Sekna was working at the time at 2010, which is an organization in Sydney that sort of looks after youth, queer youth. And so I found the help that I needed at the time, which was through Sekna. And specifically, Sekna introduced me to this concept of inviting in. And I'll get Sekna to explain that in a second, but just to go back to the context, it was a really tough time for me because my parents didn't really understand much about what it meant to be gay, and so for me to come out to them was a struggle, not just for myself but also for them. So I think what I'll do now is I will invite Sekna to join in and sort of tell you a little bit about what that experience was like for her, coming into the work that she does, a little bit of context around personal story that I think will share, and then we'll come back to me and I'll continue the presentation. So over to you, Sek.
It is such a privilege to share this space with you, Bernard. Ahlan wa sahlan, everyone welcome. And I would also like to commence by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I speak, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would also like to pay my respects to elders both past, present and emerging. I bear witness and honour their diversity, strength and resilience. As an Australian Lebanese Muslim woman living and born on Darug land, I live on Solon land, a land that was never ceded, a land that belongs to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. My work is in the context of a nation that was built on the history of genocide and the ongoing impact of colonisation. I wish to also acknowledge social justice revolutionaries, LGBTQA+ elders who have struggled in the pursuit of justice and have created pathways for me to do this work. I honour my ancestors and every person I've had the privilege to meet. And profound thanks to the Alliance who have carved out this space for me, and also to Bernard and Maria Paletta Chiarelli, who are pioneering researchers in the stories that I live. Today, I honour your resources, your own wisdoms, while I also speak from my experience about what I found helpful and significant in honouring and understanding the needs of our diverse communities. My work life is in the intersection of the personal, the political and the professional, and it has been shaped by my diverse experiences, intimately knowing violence and safety, homelessness and home, fear and peace, poverty and enoughness, all of which have brought me to this forum today. In 1999, I started practicing as a psychologist, an intern at the Transcultural Mental Health Centre in North Parramatta. There was a turning point when a mother was referred to me and diagnosed with histrionic personality disorder. While she fit the DSM criteria, her wailing and despair told a deeper story. She was grieving for her 21-year-old son who had died by suicide. She believed that not only did he suffer on earth, he would also suffer in the afterlife. She shared with me, in her Egyptian village, when a family can no longer wail for a loved one, they hire others to wail for them, signalling it is the house of grief. And grief, I learnt, was an act of love, not a personality disorder. In line with Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality work, I began to critique the engagement with diagnosis and the language of suicide. Traditional diagnosis and language surrounding mental health and suicide often obscure the violent realities faced by LGBTQ+ folks. Both the implicit and explicit homophobia, biphobia and transphobia contribute to the harsh realities. And as Vicki Reynolds reminds us, hate, torment, rejection kills. It's the homophobia, biphobia and transphobia that need to be diagnosed. So after numerous home visits early in my career, I said to my clinical supervisor at the time, by definition of the DSM, I could see the personality symptoms. However, I think she is presenting with a culturally defined expressions of grief. And to his credit, he suggested I invest in narrative therapy. So narrative therapy took my breath away, especially when I heard the main premise of this Australian-born therapy, that the person is not the problem is the problem. In narrative practice, people's unique intersectional stories mattered, not just mental health professionals' expertise. even young people could be experts of their lives, because the communities we live in invariably shape our perception of the world, be it in the world of psychology, family heritage, religions, cultures. So after my internship, I was fortunate to be employed by the Corner Youth Health Service at Bankstown as an Arabic-speaking psychologist. This is where I'd meet some young people who were hearing voices. Some families were adamant that their child was possessed by the jinn, an evil spirit, or were given the evil eye. The medical condition of psychosis did not make sense to these families, nor did the jinn to my mental health colleagues. In these situations, I would draw upon people's own cultural knowledge along with mainstream mental health services, because language shapes experience and experience shapes language. It's important to recognise what happens when we don't speak the same language. So the impact of diagnosis often obscures people's resistance and the colonial structures that perpetrate harm. It becomes individualised, and the problem is then located in people's brains and bodies, and consequently it blames the person and not the problem. Vicky Reynolds reminds us that when things are internalised, individualised, pathologised and depoliticised of these issues, it becomes problematic because we live and exist in broader social contexts. So my therapeutic work is embedded, and it is a collaborative approach with the main premise of the person, the community, the faith, the race, the religion is not the problem. The problem is the problem. So with one ear, I'm hearing people's despair, and in the other ear, I'm fine-tuning my listening for people's culturally defined resistance, resourcefulness, and resilience. I'm looking for multi-storied, not single-storied accounts of their experiences. And I borrowed the idea from Maston, who says that resilience does not come from rare and special qualities, but from the magic of the ordinary, the resources that already exist within people and their communities, their families, and their cultures. So how might we capture the power of this ordinary magic in therapeutic conversations? And I will offer an example of this magic by declaring my devotion to working with sexuality, gender, and bodily diverse folks. And the foundation of my work is the love that I have for my younger brother, Muhammad. This was instigated by a hurtful incident on my brother's 18th birthday. On this day, my brother requested that we embark on a journey to his first gay outing, now that he was the legal age to enter. We spent hours getting ready, choreographing some dance moves, sharing body glitter, hairspray, earrings at that time, and not to mention where he asked me to wax him. That night changed my life, and not because of the waxing image, but when we arrived at the venue, and we were patiently waiting in the queue to enter the club, a group of men approached us, slapped my brother on the face and berated him and said, "You all deserve this, you poofs." As I embraced my brother's face close to my heart and I felt his sobs, I hollered with a primal scream, "Why, he's not a poof, he's my brother." Over 2 decades ago, it would have been impossible for my brother and I to have gone home and told our family what had happened. This is because of the hurtful rhetoric that had been echoed in relation to sexuality and gender diverse people in our communities. And in response to the incident, we accessed many LGBT mainstream organisations, but often found prescribed ways of expressing sexualities. My brother did not want to come out. The idea of an individual claiming a lesbian, gay, bi, trans identity and coming out did not fit for us or our cultural and religious context at that time. In relation to the above-mentioned incidents, I was further disturbed to think what happened to my brother, the violence, the sense of isolation, could also be happening to other young people. And despite what I knew I was up against, I was determined to find a safe place for my brother and others, a place where young people could share their stories, where the ordinary magic of their skills of survival, their resources and resilience is acknowledged. Professionally, and to this day, I continue to witness the unconscionable consequences of coming out. Some people have endured exorcisms, spiritual healings, beatings, forced marriages, and being sent on religious pilgrimages. Others have been kicked out of home or find health practitioners that do conversion therapies. Understandably, people experience significant mental health distress as a response. This is not because they are pathological. It is a response to the pain and discrimination which is unbearable. Experiencing this kind of exclusion, abuse, and isolation, people suffer. It is not their sexuality and gender that is addressed in therapy, but the pain and suffering, as well as the resilience and healing resulting from these hurtful discriminatory acts. Oppression is social. It is not in our synapses. It does land on our body and brain. So the work of the Arab historian Joseph Mas'ad was influential for me. In his book, Desiring Arabs, he asserts that within many Arabic cultures, there are long histories of gender diversity and same-sex relations. But the categories of gay and lesbian and trans do not fit these. In fact, when human rights workers advocate for the emergence of Western-style gay and lesbian and trans identities in the Muslim world, it actually destroys existing communities. So this led me to explore how can I respond to gender diverse and same-sex attracted Muslim and non-Muslim youth in ways that will honour their desire and yet not impose only a Western understanding of sexuality. Therapeutic conversations with Muslim and non-Muslim youth showed me the dichotomy of being either in the closet or coming out is limiting. Coming out speaks to privilege and assumes safety. It can be a risky business for some. I honour the work done in the field of supporting and developing LGBT+ communities, and which has been invaluable, and the concept of coming out has been pivotal in rendering universal human rights. I acknowledge the importance of coming out as a community concept. It has given voice and impetus to broader struggles to attain legal recognition and support services for communities in mostly the Western context. But in conversations with young folks I meet who are navigating racism, Islamophobia, transphobia, racism, homophobia, a lot of them said that this concept of coming out did not fit for them. And to quote the philosopher Wittgenstein, who states, "The limits of language are the limits of my world," I was inspired by these young people to create a new process, a azime, an invitation of choosing people to come in. And in this process, young people make a conscious selection of who they would like to share their precious information about their diverse sex, sexuality, and gender, and invite these people in to become a special member of their club of life. So coming in, again, is a azime. It invites folks to explore and define their identities on their own terms without feeling compelled to conform to societal expectations of predefined narratives. It encourages a sense of agency and allows for fluidity and nuances of how people choose to share with others. It encompasses a range of experiences from selectively disclosing to specific individuals or communities to openly embracing one's identity in various aspects of their life. Now, Brilliant Bernard will expand on how this concept was relevant to him and Z in their One Footing project.
Thank you, Sek. I wonder if you want to speak to the resources quickly before I go into the podcast, in case we're joined by some clinicians. I think it might be relevant.
So from the work that was done, there was a paper that was published, and there are some resources that scaffolds questions in which we can invite people to explore this concept of inviting people to come in. I wonder, I'm mindful of taking a bit of space, so if we just quickly segue into the project, Bernard. But
No
all
problem.
of these are available, these resources.
Thank you. And I think your link tree is on the registration page anyway. So thank you, Sek, for giving us that valuable context to the important work that you have done, which has contributed to the work that I'm doing and have done. So another resource that's sort of born out of this concept of inviting people to come in was this podcast that I co-developed with Z, who is also, I won't name Z because we chose to use pseudonyms at the time, and I'm trusting that everybody here is someone I can trust. I don't mind if people know that I'm B from the podcast One Foot In. The idea behind this podcast was really to build on the concept of the fact that not everyone can be fully out and proud at all times. So we had 10 episodes where we challenged mainstream narratives of being out to ensure that the LGBT people listening, who were generally from diverse backgrounds and couldn't have both feet out of the closet. So the idea behind having one foot in the proverbial closet felt safer to them. And it was a kind of a message to send to say that you're not alone. And so we produced these 10 episodes. And they were quite successful at the time, and they're still running. And you can find the podcast on any of those listening places. But through the podcast, we applied for some grants, and we were successful with the Victorian government to develop these 2 mental health promotional videos. I will play one of them shortly, but the videos have had impact in the sense that they are now incorporated into a number of organizations, sort of affirmative practice and advocacy training programs specifically. And this is kind of beautiful because it's a kind of a complete 360 back to 2010 where I met Sekna. 2010 now uses those in their trauma-informed programs and trainings when they go out to a community. So the mental health promotion videos are intended for 2 audiences: the people with one foot in, and then the people, the loved ones of people with one foot in. And I'll just quickly play the one of those videos, and please tell me if my screen, can you see that the screen is now changed? Yep.
Hi, I'm B.
And I'm Z, and we know what it's like to have one foot in.
Both of us have struggled to come out to our families who come from cultural backgrounds that are not accepting.
We felt that we can't relate to coming out stories represented in the mainstream, which inspired us to create One Foot In.
We wanted to give people like us who have silently struggled a voice, because even within the LGBTIQA+ community, we've often felt different.
I remember when I was first coming to terms with my sexuality, I was terrified of how my parents would react because they come from a cultural background that is not accepting. I once had a friend tell me that my parents don't love me and that I should cut them out of my life.
Yeah, I had a friend tell me the same thing, and this only made me feel more scared and anxious about coming out, because I knew my family would struggle to accept me. So actually I did cut them out of my life, and I even moved overseas for a while.
I can relate. When I was reaching out to people for support, receiving this kind of advice that ignored my context just reduced my experience and my parents' experiences.
Yeah, but on the flip side, I really appreciated having others in my life who actually took the time to understand my situation and the situation around me, and were able to provide me with support that was non-judgmental and made me feel like I wasn't alone.
I totally agree, B, and it's great that't also professional support out there to help our loved ones navigate our One Foot In journey with us.
We're here.
Hi, loved ones. Mabruk. Congratulations if someone has invited you into their precious life. Trust that this decision was not easy, and they have struggled and done a lot of soul searching before they share their diverse sexuality and/or gender with you. They'll be on a roller coaster of emotions, so please, if you can, thank them for being vulnerable with you. Loved ones, you can provide support in ways that are helpful by expressing empathy, respect, and validation about what it has taken for them to share this precious part of their life with you. You may have fears and questions, and that's okay, but please leave them for another time. Better yet, please consult with a professional where it is safe and confidential for you to explore and understand your response. Please also understand that our families, culture, and religion are not the problem. It is the structures that uphold heterosexual dominance, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, racism, and so on that are.
Thank you for sharing this helpful advice, Sekna.
We hope that loved ones will feel more confident in supporting those with one foot in.
Okay, so those oh, sorry. Yeah, so there are, like I said, there's a second video as well, slightly different script. And both of these videos are available on the Linktree page. But so I think we still have a bit of time, so that's good. I think we might run slightly over, but I'll be quick with the next part. The reason I thought we integrate a bit of my research into this is because, like I said, it's really all because of Sekna's work that she's been doing for the last 20 plus years around her support of queer people of color. And it's led me to my context now. So a bit more context, and I think James touched on this. I am a lecturer at the School of Public Health at UTS, and I'm also doing my PhD at the Kirby Institute, UNSW. And so with the benefit of hindsight, I now have a platform, and I have some power that I can make some either change happen through policy, health promotion campaigns, etc., but also to bring recognition to an issue that's not unique to just myself, to Sekna's brother, to those people that we've sort of mentioned. And so this leads me to the current research. So we talked about from Google to the therapy room and now to the academic office where I'm sitting at the moment in this overheating office. I really base my research on intersectionality, and Sekna talked about this briefly. And I won't go into too much detail, but intersectionality is increasingly recognized and has been in social sciences and humanities, but it hasn't really been touched on too much in public health, specifically around sexual health. But it does provide a framework for understanding how various forms of discrimination intersect to cause the person to have a unique experience when it comes to, specifically in my domain, access to healthcare. So my research specifically examines the intersection of cultural identity and sexual orientation within an Arab-Australian context, specifically looking at GBQM, or queer, gay, bisexual, queer men who have or other men who have sex with men, exploring this nuanced way of how these men navigate the healthcare system. And the reason I think this is important is because Australia boasts a robust healthcare system. The reality, however, is that not everybody experiences healthcare in the same way because of the idea of intersectionality. And so my work sort of reveals some of these barriers. So I will be presenting a very preliminary, hopefully less than 10-minute presentation around some of those early findings from my research. And then we'll take the break. So my research presentation really is called Intersectional Identities, the Influence of Culture on the Health and Wellbeing of Gay Arab Australian Men, and this is part of my PhD. I know we're joined by some of my PhD supervisors, so I just want to give a little shout out to them and tell them that I'm not nervous at all. So I'll start with a quote from Michael. Michael is someone who both fears and loves the ocean. Michael is a gay Arab man from Sydney. He's one of our studies participants, and his words of not feeling safe around either of his communities, the gay community or the Arab community, struck a chord with me, not just because they speak to the heart of this research, but because they also resonate with my own personal journey. And I touched on that early on when I first started presenting, but despite growing up in a city celebrated for its diversity and inclusivity, I remember what it was like for me growing up as a gay Lebanese Australian man, to feel that I had no safe space in either of these communities. And I know many of you will probably remember in 2017, especially for myself, these feelings resurfaced around the plebiscite for marriage equality, where I was receiving both homophobia from my Arab Australian community that felt like it had been dormant for many years, but also racism from the gay Australian community, which also felt like it had been dormant for many years. And this particularly was prevalent because reports came out that Western Sydney had voted the highest number of no votes or answers to the plebiscite. So, and that's where I was from. So, like I said earlier, with the benefit of hindsight and my professional background in public health, I recognize that this is a problem that's not just unique to myself. And so I decided to do this PhD to look at gay Arab men. Now, because I'm doing it at the reputable Kirby Institute, initially I wanted to focus on HIV. We all might know that Australia is a world leader when it comes to gay men's HIV and sexual health research, particularly the Kirby Institute. And recently, there has been a shift in focus in government, both federal and state government policies, to look specifically at the experiences of overseas-born and culturally and linguistically diverse men. The research, however, hasn't really looked at Arab men at all. And so, and that's quite interesting considering Arabic is the third most spoken language in Australia. Arabs make up a significant part of Australia's cultural fabric. I know we're joined by many Arabs here today, even though this talk wasn't specifically about Arabs. Arabs continue to migrate to Australia from one of 22 Arab countries in the Arab world. And so this population is a significant population. And Arab gay bisexual men, that's what GBM stands for. They belong to two, sometimes three highly conflicting identities. And these identities are the reason why I'm doing the research that I'm doing. So at the start, like I said, I wanted to look at sexual health, but I had to take a step back after a scoping review, which found that there's actually nothing in the developed Western world, no research that looks at the health experiences of gay men in the diaspora, gay Arab men in the diaspora. So with these steps back, I had to look at how intersecting cultural identities influence the lived experience and access to healthcare for these men. So as any researcher here would understand, I had to go through a recruitment strategy, and I had to, really to understand their experiences, I decided to do a semi-structured qualitative research project where I interviewed men. If anyone has been to Mardi Gras, you probably know that we have a fair day. Fair Day is sort of like an event that commemorates the start of Mardi Gras. It's a really fun day in the park. And so I set up with the help of my supervisors at the Kirby Institute, set up a dedicated stall where we hope to attract participants to the study. So we had Arabic flags, Arabic music. We even had this massive banner of what looked like a grinder profile with a muscly Arab man. The strategy proved quite successful in attracting eligible participants. It also proved quite successful in attracting non-eligible participants who thought we were recruiting for a new dating app. Anyway, interviews were conducted via Zoom, and we spoke to 11 participants. Now, it's important for us to keep in mind that the participants that I interviewed are all connected to community because they were all at Fair Day, right? So the majority of them are quite well educated, full-time work. Some of them have doctorates, master's degrees. Majority were Christian, of Lebanese background, which is indicative of the Arab community in Australia. Most do come from Lebanon. So the data was analyzed using NVivo, and 4 distinctive themes emerged. And I'll try and make sure that this presentation is not too academic. So the first theme dives into the intricate process of navigating multiple conflicting identities with a focus on religious identities, cultural identities, and sexual identities. So participants revealed from early on sort of a struggle to pin down a solid ethnic identity. As we see here with Chabel's quote, there is a sort of a dissonance in how some men are perceived by others, either being viewed as too Arab from the outside or too alternative from within their Arab communities. It was also no surprise to us that religion plays an important role in our participants' identities. The 2 quotes here indicate an evolution of identity, showing that the majority have evolved the way that they see and connect with the religion, with most of them sort of distancing themselves from it over time. And with the sexual identity, and whilst most participants were very comfortable identifying as gay within the confounds of our interview and the conversations that we were having, some of them often resisted labeling their sexual orientation. with the quote that we see here from Charbel, who says, "It's hard because I don't necessarily want to identify myself in any way." And by any way, he means gay. I probably just see myself as Charbel, and that's all that really matters. I should probably also point out that these are pseudonyms and not their real names. The theme of identity set the stage and allowed us to explore how the intersectional identities affect various parts of their lives. Specifically, seems to. So my PowerPoint just restarted. Just give me a second. I'm not sure why that's happened. Maybe I'm. Okay. I think we were up to the second theme. So it set the stage for us to look at some of the environments that they are growing up and living in. Particularly stigmatizing environments, which contribute further to their experiences of minority stress and sort of impacts on their well-being. Most of our participants experience some form of stigma from their communities. Charbel's encounter here highlights how some people's assumptions and questions can be offensive and uncomfortable. So, for example, when he was asked if he owns a gun, simply because he was Lebanese. And with Rami's quote reflects post 9/11 perceptions, which everyone here will probably know about, where people's views on Arabs kind of changed. And so, and this became really prominent for Arabs specifically because it was based on religious identity. And it created a sense of division and superiority even within Arab communities, where Christian Arabs felt that they had to justify that they were the good kind of Arabs and not like the Muslim Arabs. And so this, again, further creates division within the community and religious or ethnic-based stigma. And from the other side, most participants reported that their Arab communities held stigmatizing views towards sexual minorities, including from their immediate families. For example, Rami again talks about the 2017 plebiscite, much of the same way that I experienced it, where it felt like we were being abandoned by our community because of the strong ties to religion that they had. And so that meant that they couldn't support the same-sex marriage, which meant that they couldn't support their child. And similarly, Michael here highlights how the Arab community tends to, this is again a generalization, tends to pass harsher judgments towards LGBT people compared to those within the community. For example, straight men who might cheat on their wives, no one would care, whereas a gay man would be crucified, in Michael's words. So these little microaggressions that these men experience from all sides can be subtle, but they are surely impactful. Next, the negative stereotypes, which are often intertwined with religious beliefs, can make the decision on whether to come out or to have one foot in the closet, or whether to not come out at all, extremely difficult. So here, many participants find themselves in a kind of an identity limbo, torn between their authentic selves and their cultural expectations. And of course, being in Sydney, there is a lot of them feel that there's a sense that they have to come out. So when faced with the decision, men like Nimr, for example, reflect on the impact that it will have not just on himself, but on the family as well. And similarly, Charbel talks about how the negative impacts actually outweigh the positives. The fear of not being able to protect his parents from the community's judgment and strain on important familial relationships would be irreversible. So it's just easier to not come out at all because it feels like abandoning a part of themselves. And whilst one of the participants had a fairly positive coming out experience, the majority reported a negative coming out experience, particularly when with their families. And some even talked about experiences of exclusion, rejection, or even aggression. So we've got Nadim here, who recalls violent threats from his father following an assertion that his grandmother was going to die if she was to find out. And then in the face of pressures to conform equally to heteronormative and gay cultural behaviors, some participants like Mansour chose to adopt this concept of inviting people to come in, which Sekna has talked about. So the other thing that I discovered from these men is that a lot of them have actually had their lives intertwined with Sekna, and they've either read some of her work or they've been clients of Sekna in the past. And so finally, the theme of community connectedness emerged. Participants reported experiencing tension as they navigate this pursuit of connection and belonging to both of the communities. Remember, there's the Arab community and the gay community. So, and if anyone here is familiar with gay men's research or queer community research, we know the importance of community when it comes to improving health and well-being for us. But the challenge faced by many of the participants in connecting with their Arab communities and families is the belief that family is everything is so deeply ingrained in these cultures, yet for the LGBT individual, this sometimes clashes with the very essence of their identity. So this duality, where family expectations and personal identity converge, underscores the complexity of seeking acceptance and connection with their families and, by extension, the Arab community. And on the other hand, within the gay community, and while some participants experience a sense of liberation and happiness, including using the fact that they're Arab as a way of finding sexual partners, the majority of men faced challenges such as being fetishized or being subjected to stereotypes that sort of further compounded their struggle for genuine connection with other queer men. And so as a result, and despite a strong desire for them to merge the two, participants found themselves caught in a disorienting limbo, feeling as though they didn't really belong in either of the communities. So that was sort of a preliminary summary of the identity, community connectedness stuff. And the next part of the research is looking at the way that they access health challenges. And I'm in the process of analyzing that data now and submitting it for journal publication. But really just some general overview. Some of the stuff that's come out from the health access data really is no surprise, showing things like general health challenges. So there's a sense of culturally unsafe healthcare within Australia. You have GPs who don't really understand gay men's needs. There's a little bit of a quote there from Mansour, who says that even he feels unsafe going into a doctor's clinic because he's going to see religious figures and pictures on the wall, and he'll be asked questions like, when are you going to get married? Then there's sexual health challenges. So this is the lack of knowledge by some healthcare practitioners in Western Sydney who don't really understand or don't have I guess, the literacy, the healthcare literacy or sexual healthcare literacy when it comes to gay men's health. So things like this particular pathologist not really understanding what PrEP was and not knowing what to test for when getting a sexual health check. And then, of course, there's mental health challenges. And again, I touched on this at the very start and when I talked about my own experience before meeting Sekna. And I had a very similar advice from Anglo therapist that I went to, similar to Rami's experience there, where he talks about being given stigmatizing advice, where he was asked to, why not just live a double life? Keep your sexuality private and remain closeted while getting married to women. So this is, like I said, really I just wanted to include this last slide. It's not really part of my presentation, but I thought because we're talking about health, I think it's important to just give a snapshot of what the next phase of the research is. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I will take questions. I think there's a few in the chat, and I'll attend to those at the end. Thank you, and apologies for going slightly over time.
No problem. Thank you so much, Signe and Bernard. Thank you for sharing your research and your insights and your perspective on such rich topics. Thank you. We will have an opportunity for Q&A later, and if you do have any questions, I would invite all of you to really put in your questions in the Q&A box that you will see at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat box, Liz has also shared a link to a podcast called One Foot In, and do check that out as well. It is 1:55 now. We would now perhaps go for like a 5-minute break, and we come back at 2 o'clock. And later on, Gene will be sharing his experience and his research with us. Thank you, Gene. And I'll be sharing a little bit about some of my observations and the work that I do in the peer work space. And so we'll go for break now, and let's come back at 2 o'clock. Welcome back. I'm just waiting for Jean. Hi. Hello,
Hi.
Jean. Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. So I will now hand all of us over to Jean, who will be talking about racialized sexual discrimination for the next 15 minutes or so before we go to my segment on lived experience. Jean, over to you.
Yeah, hi. I'm just gonna try and figure out how I'm meant to share my screen. Does anyone have any clue?
Can you share
At the
screen?
bottom, there's a share screen button,
All
and
right.
there's a little arrow where you can
Gosh.
select what
Yeah,
screen you want to
for
share.
sure. I knew that. Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking to you a bit about racialized sexual discrimination, which, as the title indicates, is kind of an unspoken dimension of racism. So we've spoken very broadly about what racism looks like for LGBTQIA people of color, but I don't think there's a lot of discussion, certainly not in the clinical literature, about this dimension, despite a lot of quantitative literature showing that it actually is a huge determinant of mental health and well-being for LGBTQIA individuals. A little bit about myself. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Arches. Yes, James mentioned I span across a wide range of topics. Discipline-wise, I'm a sociologist, consummate social psychologist. My PhD dissertation looked at the experiences of sexual racism experienced by Asian men who have sex with men who were born overseas, and it uses sexual fields approach, which is a Bordesian sort of framework that no one needs to know anything about. My commentary on sexual racism has previously been featured on several news outlets. I have a book chapter coming out with the Oxford University Press, and we might be doing a potential discovery project with doctors Denton Callan and Bronwyn Carlson on scalable therapeutic interventions for persons who hold sexually racist beliefs. So, despite sexual racism, RSD, not being my chief focus at the moment, I have a lot of lived experience and, of course, professional experience within this domain. Biographical profile. I am cis bisexual man, born in Singapore, ethnically Chinese. I've lived in Melbourne for 10 over years. Majority of my experiences of adult life have been in Melbourne, and so that provides me with a very interesting perspective on the topic. I've again lived experience of both sexual racism and are seeking psychotherapeutic support for coping with it, right? And so I have a long history of having to explain to practitioners what RSD is, and hopefully at the end of today's session, I'll impart with you a general idea of what it is so that your LGBTQIA POC clients don't have to. Much needed context, right? So we all know that racism within the LGBTQ community is a really huge driver of health disparities. This is especially like significant with the LGBTQ communities bit because they're often positioned as this place of inclusion and and acceptance. And when you go into those spaces and you experience the opposite of that, that can be very hurtful and very harming process. And so racism within these contexts is encountered through interpersonal racism. So that's sort of your platonic idea of racism, slurs, racial abuse, subtle variations on the theme. Also, environmental racism, right? Where specific bodies are represented and given more airtime within media, and specific voices are prioritized over others. And so racialized sexual discrimination, pardon the typo, represents a very complex interplay between these two domains. And even among LGBTIQ affirming and inclusive mental health practitioners, I don't see a lot of literacy on this topic. Case in point, I was in the process of penning a book with a researcher within this space who actually dropped out because they felt they didn't have enough professional expertise on the subject to engage meaningfully. So the highly personal nature of this topic also means that it's really confronting for those of us experiencing it. even for those of us who may benefit from these structures, and I don't just mean white LGBTIQ individuals. So depending on the context you come from, if you're part of the racial majority group, you'll likely benefit in some respects in your intimate and sexual life. I'm going to set some boundaries on what we're going to talk about today. Racialized sexual discrimination is a very contentious topic. I've experienced a lot of pushback both in professional and personal life for talking about this topic. So what it is not an attack on your individual preference. Even if you have a very specific preference for a specific racial group, this is not an attack on you. It's also not sexual socialism for persons of color. No one is advocating that you agree to sleep with every person of color that looks your way. It's also probably not run-of-the-mill racism, and initial work on this topic demonstrates some very convincing links between the two. They're quite distinct, and even people that have very progressive social views can hold RSD-related beliefs and behaviors. It's also very common, and it's also very present within Australia. And there's actual empirical evidence that backs this up, which I'll come back to in a little bit. RSD really refers to an aesthetic regime where your ethnicity and your race is a huge factor in determining how desirable you are to potential partners, right? It's not necessarily the sole determinant of this, but it's a very powerful factor, and more importantly, one that targets a part of someone's personhood that is immutable, can't be changed. It produces romantic and sexual preferences which align with existing racial hierarchies. So, that will be like people who, most of the research that deals with this topic documents, for instance, a disproportionate preference for white Caucasian partners, right? And these preferences are often also instilled in ways that are very personal and very individualized. So for instance, you may have someone someone with a very formative experience with someone from a specific racial group, or whose early experiences of sexuality pertain to erotic material that depicts very exclusively persons from a specific racial group. The issue is that the racialized structures within society both enable and kind of buttress a lot of these preferences, right? It also doesn't just refer to romantic rejection, as highlighted in some of Bernard's data. It's also fetishization. And it's important to note also that these RSD can be held by and propagated by persons of color as well. So why do we care, right? Like, why do we care that someone doesn't want to date you, or someone doesn't date your client because they're Asian? And that's because, there's a lot of convincing evidence that shows that it's associated with a whole plethora of negative mental health effects, right? So it's everything from substance use disorders, lower life satisfaction, self-esteem, poor sexual health, really restrict impositions on the sexual behaviors that people of color are expected to exhibit in intimate life. Also body dissatisfaction, body image concerns, psychological distress more generally, but also alienation from LGBTIQA communities. And as Bernard pointed out previously, that has really huge implications for mental health, suicidality, and a range of other factors. And so some of you may be looking around being like, well, why haven't I heard of this? This sounds really newfangled. And I think it's really important to recognize that there's a lot of shame attached to experiences of romantic rejection to begin with. And for some clients from specific backgrounds, there are cultural barriers to discussing sex and intimacy. And also a lot of clients will, experience a lot of shame attached to holding specific sexually racist preference. Sometimes these are even against potential partners from one's own racial background. And it's also important to note that, experiences of RSD tend to be minimized and negated by others within the LGBTIQ community, like most forms of racism. And so it's important to note that RSD is expressed differently in the lived experiences of LGBTQ people. And a lot of the research that I'm going to cite today and have cited really speaks to the experiences of gay, bisexual, cisgender men, right? But there is tentative evidence that other populations have similar experiences. For example, among lesbian and bisexual cisgender women. And below, you'll see these very intimidating graphs and figures that describe that are results from a large-scale study conducted recently about partner preferences among gay and bisexual men in Australia. As you can see here, Caucasian men, everyone loves Caucasian men, right? But Asian and Aboriginal men, very rated very poorly by the 1,853 participants that took part in this study. And so that shows you that even though individuals can have these very personalized experiences with their preference for specific partners, there is a structural element, the structural basis that undergirds a lot of these preferences. Moving on. Here are some excerpts from the data I collected from my PhD thesis about how lived experiences of racialized sexual discrimination manifest in everyday life, right? And also, I'll give you a second to peruse some of these quotes. And so you'll notice that even though these are Asian men, there is a huge disparity and a huge variation in their experiences, right? Even if they're of relatively similar ages, and roughly similar, I guess, ethnic group, although that is a bit contentious, you sort of begin to see that even between individuals, there is a huge amount of specificity. If is everyone okay with moving on? I can take that as a yes. So in my research, what I've noticed is that the sort of three domains that I really want to focus on that I think are clinically significant. And one is the interpersonal experience of RC, right? So that will be stuff like experiencing racial abuse from other gay and bisexual men, sometimes in response to being approached in a romantic or intimate setting, or sometimes just unsolicited and stochastic. Rejection is oftentimes also explicitly racialized. So that will be something like, well, I'm not into so-and-so ethnicity. I don't date so-and-so ethnicity. It takes part, it is experiences sexual fetishization and objectification. So that is kind of where personhood within a sexual setting is kind of flattened and papered over by sexual and racial stereotypes. These may be things like, well, all Arab men are like down low and masculine, and they're actually going to go back to their wives, or stuff like Asian men are like really sexually submissive, or like Latino women are really fiery, and so this gets internalized, and the subjective experience that emerges pertains to beliefs often that one's race makes them unattractive, or only attractive in a specific way, right? And I've seen, from my research, I witnessed a lot of hypervigilance around potential experiences of RC within intimate settings, and also feelings of shame and disgust towards one's own experiences of sexual racial preferences is a very common theme. And feelings of being behind one's white peers in terms of experiences with sex, intimacy, and dating is a very common theme. But it's also important to recognize how people respond to this, And so you see a whole range of behavioral responses to the right, including modifying your sexual behaviors and physical appearance, either to align yourself with or to sort of contrast more sharply with sexual stereotypes. A lot of internalization in these stereotypes, withdrawals from spaces where RSD might be more prevalent, and also feelings of hostility and competition with other people of color within community settings. On the flip side, there are a lot of responses where people fight back against RSC, calling attention to and critiquing RSC-related behaviors, trying to unlearn the sexual racial preferences that emerge from them, and also developing a more holistic sense of self-worth that isn't only focused on desirability. And finally, also learning to love and accept one's body and one's cultural heritage. And it's also really important to note here that these behavioral responses do not reflect a trajectory from responding badly to responding well, right? It's kind of interwoven and intermeshed with one another at any given point in time. And so there's this non-linear kind of learning going on with how to behaviorally respond to RSD. And so I would like to spend a little bit of time drawing on my own experiences and my own sort of work with clinicians, limited though it may be, to discuss experiences of RSD within psychotherapeutic settings. And it's important to note, of course, that there's very little literature that exists out there that discusses RSD. But what evidence we have shows that psychological flexibility is a really important factor for buffering the psychological distress experienced as a result, right? At the same time, broader principles of anti-racist psychotherapy can't lead you wrong in this regard. But I do caution against applying frameworks like CBT that tend to be very much focused on individual factors, because they do have an unfortunate history of contributing to the minimization of factors that are more structural or societal in nature, right? I also want to draw attention to the fact that attentiveness to intersecting identities is very crucial. Age, socioeconomic status, immigration, disability, religion, physical attributes like muscularity, you know, those can all play a huge role in dictating how RC is experienced. Experiential factors like sexual trauma and religious trauma are also really important. And, you know, these experiences are also very specific to specific intersections of race, gender, sexuality. So, you know, someone who's straight, and cis woman who's of Asian background is going to have a very different experience from someone who's a bisexual Arab trans man. And I think this is where the challenge of incorporating intersectionality into these settings is very evident. See, you know, there is a tendency to think of intersectionality as something that is additive, right? But in fact, it's really not. It's sort of these experiences that emerge at the intersection between race and gender, race and sexuality. And it's not something that can occur. Like, so for example, the experiences that a gay Asian male client will have will not be easily extrapolated from those of an Asian client who is cishet and male, and a gay client who is white and trans. You know, it's really very specific to these intersections, and I think that is something that is very challenging to integrate in any scale. But that's not really my job, that's yours. So hopefully I'm providing the tools to think a little bit about that. Here are some examples of the themes that might emerge in discussions about our receiving in therapeutic contexts. You know, and these are drawn both from my experiences in psychotherapy and working with individuals who've undertaken similar work. So you have discussions about self-concept, you know, how does RSC shape the sexual self-efficacy of clients? How does it impact on body satisfaction? Relationship with like and non-like others. How does this influence the way you interact with other people from your community? Sexual self-efficacy. How does it impact your sexual behaviors, your sexual preferences in the bedroom, right? And also racialized sexual preferences, like how does it impact the way that a client might make interpersonal connections, you know, and how holding certain racialized sexual preferences might expose them to certain experiences of RC. And so this is a tentative list of the references that I've gathered in preparing this slide. If you would like a list as a sort of reading list, that's great. Let me know. And finally, I would like to recommend to you a couple of books, one of which I have a chapter in, but these are really great resources for sort of understanding the centrality of RSD to the experiences of LGBTIQA individuals within community. And with that, I think that's my time. I'm going to pass over to James.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you so much. I would just like to invite everyone. Thank you so much to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have a few questions coming in. Some of them have been answered. I hope that we will have about roughly 3 minutes or so for Q&A later. So you will see some of the questions being responded to in the Q&A box. So please continue to send your questions through. And I would invite Segne, Bernard, and Jean to respond to some of these questions that you see in the box. For me, I would just like to just share a little bit, just to put everything in context. Thank you so much, Segne, Bernard, and Jean, for sharing your research and the work that you do when working with LGBTIQA+ clients from multicultural, multi-faith backgrounds. I would just like to share a little bit about my experience working in the peer workspace, because I do facilitate a number of workshops and social groups involving multicultural, multi-faith, LGBTIQA+ people, QDB-POC people. And what I notice, and I see so many of elements of your research today and your presentations, in the lived and the living experiences of these individuals. I would like to highlight that when we talk about the multicultural, there are just a few points here before we go to the Q&A, just to put things in a real-life context, right? I would like to highlight that when we talk about multicultural LGBTIQ people or QDB people, they are not a uniform group. There is immense diversity in the lived experiences, the living experiences, the outlooks, attitudes, values, and the priorities that they carry in their lives. So it is not a uniform group. Personally, I do notice that there is even if another individual and I come from the same cultural background, because I am a migrant, someone else was born here, we may share slightly different attitudes and outlooks and values, so they're not exactly the same. And so my, I would say, proposition is to consider each individual as their own. So it is not something like there is a one-size-fits-all approach. And because I have lived experience in as an overseas-born individual living in Australia, so that's where I'm going to this is where I'm going to speak from, which is using that experience as a migrant, because I've also been an international student before, so I do understand some of the challenges and the concerns that individuals sort of bring to this space. I do notice that there is immense power inequality in terms of the privilege and the agency that one gets as an overseas-born individual. Whether you're a migrant, you're a refugee, or an asylum seeker, or an international student, because coming from a home country, moving to Australia, and overnight you become part of a racial minority overnight, it can put you, in a situation where you can feel a little bit vulnerable. And because whether you're a migrant or a refugee or an asylum seeker, whether you are choosing to move here voluntarily or involuntarily, meaning that you are forcibly displaced, there is this expectation that if you say something that is not working for you, there is this almost this expectation of people around you say, but why? Then why do you choose to come here in the first place? So there is immense pressure on the individual to say that everything is like working for you, because if you say that something is not working for you or like something is not right for you, others would deem it as being ungrateful, right? So I would just like to highlight this, which is can be a concern for some of the overseas-born QDP people that we work with. The other one, it's really about this issue of racism, which has been touched on by Jean's presentation and to a certain extent by Bernard's presentation as well. This is because I'm the coordinator of Gay Asian Proud here in Melbourne. And so this is something that pops up pretty often It can happen in intimate relationships, in sexual relationships as well. And Bernard and Signe and Jean also talk about coming up, versus inviting in. And I do notice that while help is available quite easily, I think in the professional help space, like in the counseling, psychotherapy space, there's also immense value in getting support from peer workers as well, from friends, from like social networks. Sometimes because you are dealing with someone from a similar background, someone from a similar lived experience, so there is immense value because of the connection, because of the empathy and the understanding that if I say something, you know what I mean. Often personally for myself, let's say if I seek counseling and if am dealing with a counselor who comes from a different cultural background, when I say that something is important to me, I often wonder whether the person understands the degree to which I am describing my issue, because different people from different cultural backgrounds do share slightly different values. For example, I will just highlight one example, like for example, many East Asian groups, there is this notion of filial piety, which is something that you don't hear often in Western cultures, white societies. And it can really influence a lot the way that we relate to ourselves, to our family members, especially to one's parents, when considering gender, sexual identities, and then this issue of coming out, right? So it can sort of influence that. Also, Kirby Institute. So this is something that Bernard would be quite interested in. Also did a research, I think about roughly 3 to 4 years ago, understanding what are some of the barriers that are preventing people from QT people from like multicultural, multi-faith backgrounds accessing HIV testing and how they relate to and understanding their sexual health, right? So what they found out was that, let me just try to see. Yes. So when it comes to understanding some of these barriers to HIV testing, they found out that there is stigma, because in this study, it was done predominantly by, I think, Asian as well as Latin American men, yeah? And so so these are men who have sex with men. And so what they have found out was that some of the barriers include these stigma related to HIV and homosexuality, which is leading to fear, shame, and concern about being outed when accessing some of these health services. There is also great discomfort with discussing HIV prevention with partners as sex and taboo. As sex and HIV are taboo in the countries of origin. So it doesn't mean that just because these people have moved to Australia now and because they are in a different culture, people can open up more almost immediately. That is always not the case, because one would always bring their these cultural values with them, even when they move, when they live in a different country. The other parts of this research show that there is a low perception of HIV risk due to infrequent sex, frequent condom use, or being in a monogamous relationship. There's also anxiety about being already having acquired HIV, which is also preventing them from accessing HIV testing. There's also fear of HIV testing leading to shame and confidentiality concerns and meeting familiar people at some of these services. There's also fear of losing the visa if they are tested HIV positive. And this is particularly important to those who are on bridging visas, right? Where they are on temporary visas. And so there is a fear that, if they are tested HIV positive, whether they would lose their rights to remain in Australia as well. So, and also there's a lack of knowledge of services, particularly among those who are not eligible for Medicare. So there is kind of I would say a bag of reasons, quite a mixed reasons, preventing some of these people from engaging health services in taking care of their sexual health, and also in coming out, inviting in, understanding and coming to terms with their gender and their sexual identity, because all these are cultural influences. So with that, it's now 2:30. I would just like to check it with Liz. Could we spend, say, just 5 minutes answering some of the questions in the Q&A? Is that okay, Liz?
Hey, James, we've actually been answering them as we've been finishing up now. So I think we could probably finish the webinar, and if anybody wants to stay online and has any more questions, we could all hang around for another minute or two.
Sure, wonderful. Thanks to Bernard, Jean, and Signe for responding to some of these questions. There are two. Perhaps we could just. There is one more. Maybe we could just respond to Crystal's question. I'm wondering whether Jean would like to respond to that.
course.
So,
I think that a lot of times the preference for a practitioner that isn't from a similar cultural background, that's a really complicated request. And I think that has a lot to do with expectations of intra-community violence, right? So that's where someone has experienced really negative reactions from people within their own community, or who feel very like they might be compromised. Like if you're in a very tight-knit community and you see someone from your community who knows your parents, who knows your cousins, who knows your aunt, your uncle, there is that fear that your identity, your stuff might get leaked out to them, right? And so I think it's also about, I think that we might be very quick to assume that it's an issue of internalized sort of racism or oppression. But I think, it's a question of maybe meeting people where they're at. And I know that's really challenging because a lot of services have to justify keeping culturally diverse staff and expertise on roster. But I think that it's a question, again, of what is safest for the individual, right? It's trusting that the individual knows what's best for them. Sometimes I don't want to speak to someone who's going to parrot the same things that, like my parents tell me back at me, right? I want someone who maybe has a more quote unquote objective lens. Like, yeah, I know that my parents probably think this way or that way. I know that, right? And so sometimes it's also the case that, even if someone is from a certain cultural background, doesn't necessarily mean that their experiences are closely interwoven with that cultural identity. For some people, there is no conflict between, there isn't any conflict between identifying as like with Western labels and their culture, and their cultural heritage. But at the same time, that might lend them towards an affinity, or someone who's born locally might have that affinity with a practitioner who is locally born or something like that. So it's just a whole range of factors that I don't think necessarily speaks to any one experience, and it's really important to meet them where they're at and trust that when they say that that's the case, it's they know what's best for them.
Thank you, Jean. I'm wondering whether Bernard and Signe would like to add anything to Crystal's questions about cultural difference.
I second what Jean's points, the points that Jean raised around meeting them where they're at and trusting that they know what's best for them. And I think it's you're not going to get a one size fits all, and it's okay to acknowledge that you don't know sometimes and you don't have the answer, and to seek support from the multiple services. I did answer some of the questions around saying that there are support services out there. You really just need to look. And we're also happy to answer any questions. I know we've gone over time, but perhaps Liz can provide our emails or anything like that, and we can very happily answer questions. But I do second what Jean was saying around meeting the client meeting them where they're at, and also acknowledging that you might not know all the answers, and that's okay.
Thank you. Signe, would you like to add anything?
What I might do is, again, I echo the same sentiments as my learned colleagues. I will send Liz an article that explores cultural humility, sensitivity, and understanding as a possibility for people to engage with in terms of how we work with our communities with difference. But yes, we cannot assume just because we're from the same culture, we may know or understand what people are navigating.
Exactly.
Everyone has their own unique experience. With my family, there's 6 of us born to my mother's womb, and we're also uniquely different. So thank you for affording us this space to share our lived experience with the people that have joined us today. And it's such a privilege to be with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernard, Jean, and Signe. We have run 5 minutes over time. But so thank you to all who are staying. Liz, I'm wondering, is there anything else that you would like to share with us? I do understand a copy of the recording will be sent to all who have registered. Is that right?
Yeah, and I've said everything else in the chat. There's support available to anybody that wants it via QLife, and please then feel free to fill in the evaluation that I've sent through the chat as well, and we will be in touch with the recording and resources. Thank you all so much for your time. The panelists really appreciate you sharing your insights and expertise, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Liz, can I ask, do all of us just stay back after the